This lecture deals with the French and Indian War, which will be a war that will lead eventually to the American Revolution. So to understand this war, you really need to understand mercantilism and the mercantile theory. So the idea of mercantilism is it's an economic policy where wealth is power, and the key to wealth is to export more than you import or have a favorable balance of trade. So European countries competed for world power and needed colonies to provide the necessary raw materials. They take those raw materials from the colonies, produce them into something, and sell them back to them to try to get as much wealth as possible. So you needed lots of raw materials, but on the other side you also needed a market to sell those raw materials to. So the colony's role was to provide those raw materials so they can the mother country does not have to import from other nations, and they would serve as markets for exports. So you were really only, as your mother country, only exporting, and all the imports were basically free because they were coming from your colonies. So Virginia and Maryland had tobacco farmers and guaranteed a monopoly on the English market, so that was an advantage for the colonies. The colonists had the same rights of Englishmen, at least they believed they did. They had some self-government, no taxes to support the army or navy to protect them, because before the French and Indian War, there's no need to protect them. They're basically protected by being English colonies. It is not until 1763 that the Navigation Acts become a burden, because we have this salutary neglect. So we let them not follow the law as long as they didn't cause us any problems. Merchants like John Hancock will disregard or evade the restrictions, and they will get rich, a lot of them, by smuggling. And the average American was better off economically than the average person back home in England. So even though you are in some ways a second-class citizen, your life is generally still better than if you were in England. So, the disadvantage are that it stifles economic initiative due to lack of freedom. You don't really have freedom. It's kind of a planned economy for you. Southern colonies were favored due to tobacco, sugar, and rice, which is why a lot of the revolutionary events leading up to the American Revolution are going to come out of your New England and Middle colonies. Parliament set up the Board of Trade and the Vice Admiralty Courts, which we discussed, that took away the right of trial by jury and were considered guilty until proven innocent. So mercantilism begins to be viewed as insulting. Colonists were being milked like cows and kept in economic adolescence. They weren't allowed to achieve economic independence, and the British failed to see an emerging nation that was happening kind of under their nose. So we see kind of an example of this triangular trade with slaves coming from West Africa, and the manufactured goods and rum going to there from Europe, molasses and sugar going from the West Indies to Europe, which is where they're making most of their money, and they would obviously get their rice and tobacco and things like that from the southern colonies, and we would get those manufactured goods like furniture, clothing, because we have no factories to produce those by ourselves. So the French are a little different. They're not here to take over the land and colonize. They were here just to set up trading posts specifically for the fur trade, and they develop a working relationship with the Native Americans, unlike the British. The British, as we talked about in Period 2, are completely against dealing with the natives. They want them to kind of get out of the way. The French want to use them and their knowledge and their ability to get these furs as a resource. And that's really going to be one of the major causes of what becomes known as the French and Indian War. So as war is approaching, we can see the 13 colonies, we can see the English area of Canada, we can see the Spanish and Russian claims. We're obviously focusing on the British and French claims, and the French have New France along the St. Lawrence River and Louisiana. So they claim all this land, but there's not many French people actually there, as opposed to the British colonies that are becoming packed. And we see this disputed area by the Ohio River, and that's really what's going to cause the major issue, because the English are going to start to encroach over there, and the French are going to be there, and the natives are going to be quite upset that the English are coming out, which will hurt the fur trade, and that's where the French are also going to get upset, because they will start losing money based on the fact that the English are getting into this fur trade as well. So as the war approaches, the English and French rivalry erupted into really a world war. It's really the First World War, known as the 7 Years' War. The war begins over land disputes in the Ohio Valley, at least in North America, and British want part of the fur trade and the two openings into North America, the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. So they want access to that. The English and the 13 colonies fight together to defend their empire. Who are they fighting? They're fighting the French and their native allies in addition to the Spanish. And George Washington is really the guy who starts this war as a young British officer, he goes out onto a French fort and causes a major fight, and that eventually leads to the beginning of the French and Indian War. So again, this the Ohio River Valley is going to be very important to both the French and the English. They both claim it because they both want access to this fur trade, and both countries will build forts to defend their claims. As you can see, they're right along that Allegheny River by that Ohio River Valley as well. So the British were concerned about French forts in the Virginia territory because they claimed Virginia to basically go to the Pacific Ocean. So they sent Washington, a major in the Virginia militia, to the Allegheny River Valley. He leads 300 men against the French at Fort Duquesne and kills over 100 French. Along the way, Washington builds Fort Necessity, and the fort falls to the French in a skirmish that will lead eventually to the French and Indian War through these small battles. A British statement later said that Washington's first skirmish, the volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America, set the world on fire, because this war is going to be a world war in Europe, in Asia, in all of North and South America as well, all the British and French colonies that they have. That's what they're fighting for, and over are these colonies. So as this war begins in 1754, there's a group called the Albany Congress, which is convened by British and led by Benjamin Franklin. It's the first real attempt at total colonial unity. Only 7 of the 13 colonies actually attend. The thought was, if we keep the Iroquois loyal and bolster the defense against the French through colonial unity. So the Iroquois will go with the strongest of the two groups, so we can keep the Iroquois with us because we come together as one set of rather than 13 independent colonies. That might be better. It's sponsored by Benjamin Franklin, but the Congress could not agree on bylaws of the Albany Congress, and none of the colonies were willing to share tax collecting powers with the British, which becomes a problem. Also, the British are afraid of the idea of colonial unity because as they become together, they become stronger, and they might not need to be British anymore. So we can see this is really a world war. It happens in India, it happens in North America, and it happens all across Europe with different allies siding with the British and the French. So what this war brings out, as we have the colonial militia fighting alongside the British regulars, are tensions, because they realize kind of how different they are. They have different methods of fighting, with the Indian-style guerrilla tactics on our side and the British Martian formation and very regimented types of fighting. The military organizations is different. The colonial militia served under their own captains, but British officers wanted to control them because they didn't have quite the amount of respect or training. Their military discipline is beyond comparison because the British are so drilled and they have tough discipline. There really is no protocol in the American colonists because they are militia. The finances, they don't want rising taxes to impede upon the colonial freedom, and the British thought that the colonists should pay for their own defense. Our demeanor is more casual, and we are not professional soldiers, versus the British officers and soldiers who were, officers of the king. They took their job very seriously, and it was their career. So we see that the French will lose the war and all the land in North America. The British inherit a vast set of new lands in North America, all of what was once New France. The Great Britain accumulates huge war debts to fight for this war, and that's obviously going to be a problem. The colonists realize that the British are not invincible and seek independence because they can they see that, the French hold a good fight. England sees responsibility to defend the empire in North America, so they're going to leave a lot of those troops there. And King George and Parliament will tax the colonies because they believe, rightly so, that the colonies started the war so that they need to pay for their own defense. So in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, it's important to differentiate because there will be a Treaty of Paris in 1783 as well. But Treaty of Paris of 1763 ends the French and Indian War. France will lose her Canadian possessions and most of her empire in India, and any claims to the east of the Mississippi. So now the colonies own, or the British Empire owns, colonies from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Spain will get all of the French lands west of the Mississippi River, so France is completely out of North America. New Orleans, but they lose Florida to England. That's eventually going to go back to them. And the English got all the French lands in Canada, exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade, and commercial dominance in India. So they gain a vast wealth from this, but they still feel that because the colonists started this war, that they should therefore at least assist in paying for it. So as you can see, the same map showing what it was like before the war starts, however, how vastly different it changes after the war. Now what you also see is the proclamation line of 1763, which is going to cap where the British colonies can move west. So, what effects does the war have on the British? It increases her colonial empire. It greatly enlarged England's debts, which they are considerably worried about. It's not like today where countries run large debts. They didn't want any debt because wealth equaled power, if you recall, for mercantilism. Britain's contempt for the colonial created bitter feelings, so they don't really like each other. Therefore, England felt that the major reorganization of her American empire was necessary, and really what was going to happen is to enforce laws that were already on the books, and also to ensure that they paid for for their defense. On the American side, it unites them against a common enemy for the first time, in this case the French and natives, eventually it'll be the British. It created a socializing experience for all the colonies who participated, so now we know each other a little bit across the 13 colonies, and it creates kind of a common enemy in the British as they start to impose taxes and enforce laws that they didn't previously. So since until 1820, King George III is in control of England, and he is instrumental in ending the French and Indian War. He was a strong supporter of taxing the colonies to pay off the debt, in his view. He owns them, and he felt that they kind of started this war. He opposed any compromise with the colonial government in America because he feels that he is the king, and they are colonies. Their purpose is to serve him and the country. So at this point, maybe the revolution doesn't happen, but by 1763, we start to see Indian attacks of British colonists are on British colonists, and it forces the British to build forts and protect settlers moving westward. So again, this is going to be a cost for the English government. One of the big ones is Pontiac's rebellion. Chief Pontiac was an influential Ottawa leader who encouraged his people not to make peace with white settlers. He is murdered by those who oppose his political views, but this shows that there's going to be further issues with the natives, no longer with the French, but the British might have to come protect their colonists from the British, especially if we continue to move west. So the colonists feel it's their right to move west since they did participate in the war and they helped England win it. So they start moving into this new territory, and it causes more and more Indian attacks like Pontiac's rebellion on their settlements, and Great Britain would prohibit the colonists from moving west through this proclamation of 1763 to try to A, protect them, but also to control their expansion so it wouldn't cause more of a cost for them to continue to protect them as they move west. And again, probably the largest impact of the French and Indian War, what leads to the American Revolution, is not only the large debt England incurs and the taxes that will be put on it. It's this feeling that Americans, they participated, so they should get some of the benefits of the French and Indian War. So this proclamation of 1763 kind of puts a kibosh on that. The British land policy temporarily keep colonists out of Indian lands until treaties could be negotiated with the tribes. So it wasn't permanent, but colonists kind of wanted to do it right now. So colonial pioneers such as Daniel Boone defied the proclamation, so now they're breaking a law, a new law, and again, we're going to start enforcing those laws more, crossed the Appalachian Mountains and settled in areas that would become Kentucky. The belief was that the land westward was sacred land, people fought and died for it, and it is their birthright. It belonged to the Americans. It kind of starts the idea of this American dream that if you move west and broke the law, they thought it was an unjust law, that you could possibly, even not necessarily gain great wealth, but at least have a better life out in the western part of the country. Now they fought for it, so they feel that they deserve it, and it's obviously going to cause more issues with the English government.